Hi everyone, welcome to this series of Spring Security Implementation. And in the last video, which is part 2, we have covered two things. We updated the custom security configuration file and configured password encoder to encode the password. And also, we added role-based access configuration. Role-based access basically we used in those scenarios when we have a multiple users in the application, but all these users belongs to a specific type or category, which is known as role. So the endpoints and the endpoint access is based on the type or role of the user. Let's continue this series, and today we are going to work on a specific requirement. So requirement is create a post REST API to authenticate a user. Client application like Postman will pass username and password as JSON payload, and the API will respond as a message. It may be a user found and user not found. Basically, if you see in the right bottom, we are going to use a table in the database to maintain the multiple users. So this table has ID, username, password, enabled flag, and role. So till now we're using the users from the memory, but now we are going to maintain users in the database and this table will be used. So we are going to work on this login endpoint, and to implement this login endpoint, these four steps we need to follow. So first we will create an entity class and we will give name to this entity as user entity. And second, based on entity, we will create a JPA repository. So basically JPA repository is used to perform the CRUD operations. And third, we will use and create a service, user service implementation. And finally, we will expose one post REST API for login, and it will accept as a payload username and password and verify this username and password from the database. If that provided username and password exists in the DB, then this API will respond as user found, and if provided username and password not found in the database, then this API will return a message user not found. Let's move to the coding part and create a user entity class. So use two annotations on class level to make this entity. So one is @entity and second annotation is @table, and here provide the name of the table. So as we discussed, it will have ID, username, password, enabled, and role fields. So here every user will belongs to a specific role, and for role we will use enums. Let's create the enum. So there will be two roles, admin and manager. Now use ID and generated value annotations on ID field, and strategy we will use identity. So here role is of type enumerations, so need to specify here, and we will use annotation enumerated to specify it is a enum, and also we need to define the type of enum. Now generate the getter and setter methods corresponding to each written fields. Select all. So here is one point, and in order to use this entity class in a Spring security, we need to implement one interface user details in this user entity. Now let's implement it. So as we know, when we implement any interface, we have to define the methods of the interface. That's why it is showing us an error. So let's implement all the required methods. So these are the 5 methods which are the part of this user details interface we implemented here. So for now, provide some static values like is account non-expired, return true. Then is account non-blocked, again return true. Then is credential non-expired, again return true. And there is another method, get authorities. So here we need to return a collection, and here we will use class simple granted authority and pass the role. So let's recap it. We created one user entity class and marked it as entity by using two annotations @entity and @table. Then we added ID, username, password, enabled these fields and used two annotations @ID and generated value on ID field because this ID is referring to the primary key in the table. Then we added role as well, and in order to maintain multiple roles and as a best practice, we created one enum and defined two roles, admin and manager, and same enum we used here, but it is a enum. So in order to specify enum in the entity class, we use this annotation @enumerated and we given type string. This is of one part. And second part is this class we are going to use with the Spring Security. So we need to implement one interface, user details provided by Spring Security. So see here, this interface is provided by security package. So this interface has few methods that we need to override. One is account non-expired, we return true for now. Is account non-locked, we return true as well. Is credential non-expired, again returning true. And then there is another method, get authorities. So here we need to return the role specific to the user. So here we used role, but this method returns a collection and it should be of type granted authority. So we used one simple granted authority class and pass the role to this, and further this object we are returning as a collection using a method list.off. These are the steps to create user entity class. User entity is ready to use. Now let's create a repository. In order to create a repository, create a new interface and name it as user repo. Use annotation @repository to mark this interface as a repository and extend GPA repository interface. This repository we are creating for user entity. So need to specify here the entity name and need to specify the data type we used for the ID in this entity. Now repository is ready. Need to define one method here, find by username. Import optional from java.util package. That's it. So this repository is ready for use. Now let's create a service which will use this repository. Create a new class, name it as UserDetailsService IMPL, and implement one inbuilt interface provided by Spring Security. User details service. Now it is a interface that we are implementing. So this user details service has one method that we need to override, and this method name is load user by username. Now here auto-wire the repository, and here use repository method find by username and pass the username. If user not exists, return null. So now service is also ready to use. We created one class, user details service IMPL, and need to implement one interface, user details service, and this interface is provided by Spring Security. This interface has one method, load user by username. We implemented it and defined it. So here in this method we used user repo we just created earlier and used its method find by username. So pass the username. If user exists with this username in the DB, it will return us object of user entity. Otherwise, it will return null from here. So user service is also ready to use. Next, we need to create one endpoint, open employee controller, and here expose one post endpoint. Use post mapping, and this is for login, so provide the mapping as well. This method will return string only, and in the request body we will get username and password. Receive that username and password in the form of map here. Now here we have a username, so as per username we need to find a user. So in order to find a user, we will use a method of user detail service IMPL method, load user by username. So here in the controller, let's first auto wire user detail service IMPL. So we auto wired user detail service IMPL, and here call a method load user by username and pass the username. So here we called method load user by username. It will search this given username in the DB. If it's found, then we will storing this user object in the DB user object. If this condition is true, DB user object not equal to null, we will return message user found. Otherwise, user not found. We need to return object of response entity and return the message created above. So first of all, in the employee controller, we auto wired this user details service implementation class, then exposed one post endpoint with request mapping login, and it will receive username from the client request. Using load user by username method of user details service, we are fetching the user from the DB. If user found, then we are returning message user found. Otherwise, we are returning a message user not found from this endpoint. So at this point, this endpoint is fully completed to test, but in view of Spring Security, it is incomplete. We are learning Spring Security step by step. That's why we are completing the functionality step by step. So this endpoint is for now ready to test, but in the coming videos of this series, we will complete and update this endpoint as per need of the JWT authentication. So now save the changes, execute the application and test this endpoint. Let's execute the application. So here in the console, we can see one error, and the description of this error is, so this error is saying that we auto wired user detail service IMPL in the controller, but this service could not be found. So let's review the code of user detail service IMPL. So we created class, implement this interface, auto wire the repository, override the method, and calling a repository method and returning the result. Okay, so here we missed to designate this class as a service, so we have to use @service annotation on class level. Now this class is designated as a service. Save the changes and try to run the application. So now error has been removed and application started on port number 8080. Now using the postman, try to hit the endpoint. So this is the endpoint login, and here we are not passing any authorization and just passing the username. So it's returning 401 unauthorized, and this newly created endpoint is not accessible because we need to whitelist this login endpoint in the custom security configuration. Now move to the coding and open security configuration, and this is the place where we whitelist one existing endpoint about us. So now place a comma and also whitelist this login endpoint as well. Save the changes and execute the application. Application started. Now pass anything. Now endpoint has been whitelisted and we are able to access, and it's returning user not found. So remember, we created user entity. So when we execute this application, automatically a one table will be created with user's name. So user table created, but there is no entry yet. So let's log in H2 console and add few users to test this functionality. Go to the Chrome browser. We have two users in this application, user 1 and user 2. Try to log in. So here we are unable to log in. Open the inspect window and check what is the issue. Refresh the page. Now see here. So basically we are trying to access swagger-ui.html page, but Spring Security not allowing us and returning 401 unauthorized response. It means now we have to whitelist the Swagger UI HTML pages as well. Go to the configuration again, and here we need to provide custom initialization of web security using web security customizer. So use @bean, create a method which will return web security customizer, and here use web object and ignore what we want to ignore. We want to ignore Swagger related all the HTML pages. Give request matcher, and what is the root of the URL, all the URL related to Swagger. So this is another change we need in Spring Security configuration. We need to whitelist all the pages related to Swagger. This configuration only requires if you are using Swagger. If you are not using Swagger, then this is not a compulsory. Now save the changes and again execute the application. Application started. Again refresh the page and try to log in. We are able to access. Now in the left side we can see employee table and users table. Now add one entry or more than one entries in this table. So here it's showing admin entry already because I already made this entry. In order to make more entries, you can use H2 console, and when you will access this table first time, there will be no entry, so you need to make some entries. So here I'm going to add more entries. So now this table has two entries. Open the Postman and test this functionality. So this is a post endpoint login, and here in the authorization we are passing no authorization, and as a payload we need to pass username. So in the database we have two valid users, admin and manager. Let's first try with wrong user, dummy. So we passed invalid user, dummy, and API responding us user not found. Let's try with valid user. So API responding as user found, and also try manager. Again we are getting response user found. So this endpoint is working as expected.